Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and welcome everyone to the National Endowment for Democracy and the World Movement for Democracy. My name is Ryota Jonen, and I'm a director of the World Movement here at NED. The World Movement for Democracy is a global network of democracy activists, human rights defenders, scholars, and practitioners such as parliamentarians to respond collectively to the global challenges that we are facing to democracy today. And NED serves as a secretariat for the world movement. I met Glanis Changachiriere in early 2012. It was Johannesburg, South Africa, and it was a workshop we organized and brought together young activists from several countries, such as Zimbabwe, Venezuela, Belarus, and Burma, and a few other difficult countries. And the workshop's idea was to bring these young people together, help facilitate exchange of experiences in mobilizing other young activists, young people, and deepening their understanding of the democratic values in their respective countries and communities. Since then, Glanis has become a leading figure in the world movement. In October 2012, she was one of the 3 opening speakers at our global assembly in Lima, Peru. There she told us her personal story. In that speech, she said she was a rebel in growing up. As she was growing up in the rural Zimbabwean community, she was always surrounded by various traditional, religious, and societal limitations. But her determination to be a master of her own destiny has kept her going. And now, she's an inspiration for many young women and men in Zimbabwe and for many of us in the world movement. Through the short film that you're about to watch, called Girl Child, we have tried to visualize that story that she told us, along with nearly 500 democracy activists from the world in Lima, Peru, with a negative narrative that we're seeing on civil society and democracy activists all around us today. We believe that the stories like this needs to be widespread and shared, and we need to engage more in using the visual storytelling tools to generate public debate on the importance of a democratic space in which individuals like Glanis can make a real difference in people's life. Glanis and her colleagues in Zimbabwe have used this video to facilitate such political debate with public servants, school teachers, students, and other people from the general public who not necessarily come to discussion like this, the typical civil society workshops and discussions. I remember a couple years ago, she and I were showing this film in Harare, Zimbabwe. And one gentleman from the audience stood up and said, "Hey guys, why are you guys showing this Western feminist film?" And this really triggered very deep discussions about how people see democracy, how people see and how they define feminism, but also how they understand Western values, traditional values, and African values. And this was a great opportunity for us to engage with people who don't usually share our values, right? And this is what we wanted to do with videos like this. So today, I invite you to watch this film, Girl Child, and the screen will be followed by the discussion on the women's political participation with Glanis, Kamissa Camara, the senior program officer at Africa team here at NED, and also Amanda Domingues, the senior program assistant in the Gender, Women, Democracy program at NDI, National Democratic Institute. And the discussion will be moderated by our colleague, Natalie Kay, Assistant Program Officer at Africa team here at NED. So enjoy this film. Thank you for coming.
No one hears anything, right? Okay, all right, just checking. Oh, that would be why. Pardon me.
I am Glanis Changachiriere. I am a Zimbabwean. I am a women's rights activist. I would say, well, I'm proud to be Zimbabwean. It's a country that believes so much in our tradition, in our history, and the larger population really believes that you have to do good to others, just you would want them to do unto you. And they want to see the country moving forward. Speaking broadly about its politics, I would say everyone has a dark side of life and every nation has a dark side. So this dark side tends to overshadow, the light that Zimbabwe has. We are not yet there in terms of democracy. We still have a long way to go because for me, I think when we begin to talk about democracy at that level, we begin to talk about a society in which one's views are respected, no matter which way they are going towards. Really, every Zimbabwean was just frustrated, pissed off, so to say. It's also a highly patriarchal society where men tend to dominate women, in a number of spheres. The religious, even in politics, at social level. But upon getting into varsity, I actually realized that most girls or most young women really, they just wanted to proceed with their education, but it didn't really, have a meaning in their lives because then you're just going to school, but at some point you get married and then you look up to your husband and so forth. So as I was growing up, I could see, those tendencies where the family tends to have a bias towards the boy child, and really there was no priority to educate the girl child. It's very complex, really, for one to be just a girl child in a rural setup because there are so many societal expectations around you before you even know who you are. Society really puts more emphasis on modeling you for the betterment of the society rather than investing in you and what you need to see of yourself.
Mukukura kwake kubva ari mudiki anofanira kuva ari mwana anoteerera vabereki. Wani ateerera vabereki, mwana anosungirwa kuti ave mwana anotumika, anoti kana asati aendawo kuchikoro.
At the same time, you also have your personal to take care of. You need to be able to bath and to dress in a certain way. And you also need to be able to always respect the elders, no matter what they say to you, no matter how they talk to you, no matter how they treat you.
Tuomera semadzimai echidiki nekuti takanga tisina chokuita community. Most of us vazhinji vacho vana kuenda kuchikoro tikapedza.
Some of those things are things that I was questioning as I was growing up, to say, so really a young woman or a girl can't have a life of their own? There wasn't that emphasis, to say we're investing in your education, therefore we are investing in you, and this should ultimately shape your life. I'd say my parents, they really wanted us to go through secondary school, but I think they had financial resources because my farm was just a farm manager at a church farm where he was doing more of charity work than working to earn income and then send us to school.
Saka Glanis wakaita chikoro asvika muform 3 ndopandakabata dambudziko rakakura. Akarwara akuitanga kuita form 3. Akarwara zvekuti first term yese haana kutomboenda kuchikoro, ende handina kuzombofungira futi kuti anga azoenda kuchikoro. Zvino sezvinoita Mwari akazongoti raramei, akazotanga chikoro muna May. akazovavarira kuenda kuuniversity.
They didn't see the need for me to, to go to university because one, they didn't have the money, and two, they were not sure what value that was going to add to me and also to their family. So it was really my, hard pressing that saw me going to university. The government was still able to provide students with some grants or some loans. But however, when I was in my second year now, the government changed the policy. They introduced fees to university students. And it was very, very difficult for me, to go through and finish my varsity.
Ndokumubhadharira mari shomanana yaakarejestwa kuuniversity. Asi mari zhinji yese akazvibhadharira wega.
So I resorted to, working during vacations and then paying for my fees.
Maholidays ese akanga asisauye pano pamusha achiti akapedza chikoro chete vakanga vavhara paholiday voenda kunotsvaka basa vosevenza. Kusvikira akavavarira kuuniversity yese akazvipedzera wega.
I became part of the students' movement that was fighting for the scrapping of those fees and, demanding the government to revert back to the loan system because we could just not afford to pay for our fees. And for most students really were from, poor backgrounds. I was just so determined, to make a difference.
Ndaingomushuvira kuti avewo mwana anoonekwawo mukati mevamwe vana, asi handina kunge ndakatarisira pane zvaasvika iyezvi. Pari nhasi ari kundiratidza kuti
in my other life when I was a student, I was very radical, and my father used to know me, expressing myself the way I felt at that particular moment. Sometimes with no respect. When you look at a young woman, especially coming from a rural background, there is a multi-layer of discrimination, oppression, and obstacles. No matter how pleasant or unpleasant the situation is, we are so scared of, trying to open the box and see how much light there is out there. Much as people are afraid of, seeing things differently, I think there's always a part of them really that wants them to see that, but just that they are not brave enough, or maybe they need a push, to say, no, you can go towards that direction and try to, experience it yourself. So when I joined the students' movement, it was also, my desire to say, we are equally the same as our male counterparts and we can equally represent our other students. I think as young women, we need to redefine ourselves, both to ourselves and also to the society. They need to see a young woman in a different way altogether. So it was those, cumulative trends that just pushed me to the edge to say, I need to be able to do something about this. And we need to be able, to have a space really where we need to talk about our life.
Sister, 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 sister.
The Institute for Young Women Development was primarily created to be able to, create a platform whereby you're then able to begin looking for solutions for the challenges that you're facing. Our vision really is to see a society in which young women are able to have access to resources and opportunities to live a life of their choice. Young women were not being seen as equal citizens, so we didn't have a right to human dignity as what our boys or male counterparts had.
Katanga upenyu wakatanga kuuya, even our rights chaiwo tanga tisingazive ma-human rights edu semadzimai echidiki tasingakwanise kuzvimirira mudzinga dzedu.
So we've done a lot of work around educating young women on their rights, beginning with the socio-economic and political rights. So we've also spoken about the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women, which speaks highly to the kind of life that young women in rural communities go through. We have a national law called the Domestic Violence Act. It speaks basically against eradicating domestic violence that mainly is targeted at women by virtue of being women. That's how you begin then challenging or directly challenging, the existing system and existing structures. So it's this over-dependence on our male counterparts that we also wanted to work on reducing, so that the young women are also able to have, a certain level of choice where they will determine what they want, how they want it, and how they can do it. So we actually came up with a pillar of entrepreneurship and livelihoods that basically sought to promote entrepreneurial thinking to have a sustainable livelihood. We also found it that for our work to be effective, we also needed to influence the community at large. People who are key players in as far as justice delivery is concerned are the traditional chiefs. My wow moment was when we were able to bring to the table traditional chiefs, to begin dialoguing with us and to see them express interest in the work that we were doing. And we trained them on young women's rights, encouraging them to use a rights-based approach rather than a traditional approach. They were very receptive of that. And they even went to an extent of inviting us to play a paralegal role in these courts and be able to influence their judgments.
Saka mwanasikana ndakaona kuti ini akakosha. Ndakazoona ini kuti kudzidzisa mwanasikana hakusi kuparadza nguva, ndo kuzvichengeta mangwana anokuchengeta.
Zvakawanda zvakatibatsira institute, takakwanisa kupiwa maproject kuti tikwanise kunge tichizvimiririrawo tichiitawo mabasa emaoko semadzimai.
Basa iri ndinoona kuti rakanaka. Vana vasikana kuchikoro nevakomana, chinhu chakanaka chinoburikidza nharaunda yedu.
Zvino apa ndiri kuona kuti Glanis watiita kuti tibatane zvakanyanya. Tiri kubatsirana naGlanis pamwe chete, vari kushuwira kuti tienderere mberi.
My partner, we actually have a shared vision. He is also a human rights defender. So he's very supportive to the kind of work that I do, and with him I have no problems.
I've come to appreciate Glanis' work more from the young women's perspective, knowing that myself, herself, we are still young people, and we both still belong to the demographic group that we would call young people. So I've come to appreciate that their work is a bit removed from the conventional civic society work that you will find taking root in Zimbabwe.
Takanga tiri vanhu kuti takanga tisina zvekuita muupenyu. Even our human rights semadzimai, women's rights semadzimai, rights edu burikidza neInstitute for Young Women.
When I began my activism, there wasn't really anybody I had seen to say, well, this is my role model. And also because of growing up in a rural setup, you have little access to the media. So you don't know much about women who are doing things out there. But as I then, intensified my activism, I began to see myself in other women who were also, fighting for women's rights and representing the rights of even the young women. But I wouldn't say I'm a social worker. For me, really, there's a certain drive, that tells me that I need to actively do something in order to bring about the transformation that I need to see. I'm very positive about things. There are some things that you just can't run away from. The biggest challenge are the misconceptions around activism work, where people already have these, illusions and feelings that you are driving a certain agenda. Like for me, when I was a student activist, really, I was very radical in terms of approach and just for representing students' interests and fighting for female students' rights. There are still elements that feel that they are quite comfortable with the status quo, so they'll do anything really, to suppress all the voices that try to speak out. There's a lot of censorship, there's a lot of, mistrust, and so it's a very scary terrain, where I'm treading. If you are a change maker, people need to hear you. You need to be able to speak out, but you're really clear and you are strong about what you believe in and what you want to see. So the idea also to mobilize and to organize young women is also to say how can we challenge, these systems that all around us are deterring us, from being who we really are. We need to be the masters of our own destiny.
Saka nebasa rake iri ndinozoona zvakakodzera kwazvo kuti vana amai iye dai Mwari achimukomborera agona kuenderera mberi nokupawo dzidzo kuna vamwe vana amai kuti vaitewo samai vake vakamuchengeta.
Kare kwanga kusina dzidzo yakanaka, iye zvino iri kukurudzirwa kuti tinofundisa vana vedu atichaita zvataita kare nekudzvinyirirwa ayo ndizvino tiri kukurudzira kuti zviri kufambira mberi.
I see Glanis is not going to take a rest until she sees that the young women themselves have a free political space to participate within the democratic processes that takes place in the country.
Tichizvimirira kuti nyika yedu ibudirire ende tichikwanisa kunge tichisimudza vamwe vedu madzimai ari mucommunity yedu yatinawo, tikwanisa kuvapo ruzivo norubatsiro kuti vakwanise kusimuka vachitirowo patiri kubvonapo.
Akautaya kumusha akagona kubatsira kumusha kwake kwaabva nokumberi kwaari kuenda ari kungobatsira futi, saka ndinobidza nezvakare zvakaita mwoyo waana wewo.
It's quite important really for the society to realize that when they invest in a young woman, they are investing in their communities and therefore their nation.
Wakanga aine chishuwo mumwoyo make chatakanga tisingaoni tese vamwe. Ndinokumbirisa kuti ini dai isu vanhu tikaita mweya wekuti mwana musikana mwana mukomana vese vana pana asiri munhu munyika.
Way that really presents a good jumping off point to transition from talking about the documentary to how we can better promote women's participation and leadership more broadly. I am Natalie Kay. I should have started with myself. I'm an assistant program officer here at the National Endowment for Democracy, working on our Southern Africa Grants program. So I've had the great pleasure of working with Glanis and her staff at the Institute for Young Women in Zimbabwe. So I'm really happy to be here. To my left is Kamissa Camara. She's our senior program officer for West and Central Africa at NED. She oversees the grants programs in those two sub-regions. She's an expert on politics in these countries, and she also has expertise on election management. She does training for election officials in several different countries, and she used to work at IFIS, working on election assistance programs there. And then we have Amanda Domingues. She is from the National Democratic Institute, where she works on women's participation issues there. And she has a master's from UCLA, where she works specifically on women's participation, constitutional reform, and she focused her research on gender quotas and constitutional issues. So welcome, all of you. Amanda and Kamissa are going to kind of help us broaden the context, put what we hear from Glanis into a more global context. But first, we'll let Glanis speak a little bit more about what you saw in the documentary. It's been it's been a few years since this was filmed. It was filmed around the time of the last elections in Zimbabwe in 2013. And now we're coming up to the next elections in Zimbabwe next year. So could you please speak about what has changed since then? How has your work in Zimbabwe evolved? What have you learned? And what progress has been made in women's participation and leadership?
Thank you, Natalie. I should say that I think this film was shot before Zimbabwe's 2013 election, but after coming from a 2008 election, which was very violent and quite historical in our political space. And what I saw introducing the film prior to 2013 election was a context in which young women and other young people that we showed this to sort of felt that it wasn't really the right time for us to be talking about women's political participation, given what had happened in 2008. But what I found profound for me was how those memories that people had of a violent 2008 election was supposed to inspire us to even do more in calling for a peaceful election where women are actually able to participate. And I should say that I think that thinking really helped a lot in terms of the work that we're doing, and we're also trying to encourage traditional leaders in rural communities to speak against politically motivated violence as a way of encouraging women and young women to participate. And interestingly, in 2013, we had then an election which was semi-peaceful. And that was very exciting for me because it really showed that there was room for us to even do more in terms of advocating for women's political participation. So we continued to show the documentary after that. And as we showed it more, there was more and more interest coming out of young people, and interestingly, more young women, including those in urban areas, those in tertiary institutions, whom we showed the film in. And in as much as the conversations really evolved around three key things: feminism, those were some of the arguments that people were putting across to say this is what they are reading in the film, and others were talking about education, and also I think a strong inclination of a conversation around political participation of young women and women in general. So those conversations really helped us to continuously mold and continue to have debate around how we can enhance women's political participation in a context where, when women claim space, it's like they're accused of being feminist and anti-man and anti-existing structures and systems of governance, and also in a context where most of the young women do not have adequate education. It's tertiary institutions that make them more competitive than their male counterparts. So it's really helped us have evolving conversations that I think today I can proudly say there is more noise in Zimbabwe about the need to see young women take an active role in the center of politics. We showed the documentary at the US Embassy at some point, and we invited key young women from different tertiary institutions and also young women from different political parties. And after the showing of the documentary, there was really a drive to want to see young women organizing deliberately to target the 2018 election. And so currently there's a campaign that's running where young women are being encouraged to register to vote, but also run as candidates and also be able to provide leadership in our national politics. So for me, that has really shown how the documentary has inspired conversations that are stimulated, that are enhanced at stimulating young women's interest to participate in the broader political space of Zimbabwe.
Okay. Thank you. So now we'll turn to Kamissa. Kamissa, you work with activists and institutions in several different African countries. Obviously, the barriers that Glanis has been struggling with are not unique to Zimbabwe. So we thought maybe you could offer some examples of some promising trends in women's leadership in other countries.
Thank you, Natalie. So there are definitely a lot of positive trends on the continent. But to come back to the topic of the short movie that we just saw, I didn't see any feminism or any anti-anything. What I saw was leadership. It was the leadership of a woman at the family level, which transformed itself progressively at the community level, and hopefully one day at the national level. There is an African saying that goes, once women reach the top, they get in the room and then they close the door, so as to prevent other women from getting in. Although this is not always true, I think that the top might not be the ultimate goal here. What is planting seeds on every level, at every level of society, so that women leaders are not called women leaders anymore, but leaders, period. So what struck me from the documentary here are three things, and I think they are key in the making of women leaders, and I think they made who you are today, Glanis. The first one is definitely support, whether it is support at the family level. You come from a modest background, some of us do. Family support and moral support are definitely key. In the documentary, we heard that the government provided loans for young students to be able to go to school. I think that's key support from the government. There are quota systems that are out there also to support women's leadership. So I think that without support, it's quite impossible to make it. The second aspect that I've heard, and I think that is key here, is the role of role models. When one woman does the right thing, chances are that other women will also follow suit and will want to look like her, will want to do the same thing as her, will want to follow her steps. So I think that's quite important. And Glanis, it looks like you are a role model in your society. But for other role models on the African continent, there are great influencers who've made it. Thinking Joyce Banda in Malawi, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf in Liberia, Mimi Touré in Senegal, who was Prime Minister, Fatou Bensouda at the ICC. I can go on and on. Hillary Clinton, I had to put her name in there. She's African for the day. So I think that all these women have managed to tackle zillions of obstacles and they have made it. And I think that as a woman, these other women who've made it ground you, inspire you, and show you every day that there is something more that you can achieve. The third aspect that has come back often in the movie is education. And I think education is key here. It does give you as a woman a status. When a woman comes up to me, it doesn't matter how much I dislike her. If she has a PhD from Oxford University, I'm going to respect her. And I think that that's important. But I'm not sure that education provides you with all the skills that you need to succeed and survive in a male-dominated society. I think that hard work, persistence, perseverance do, and these things cannot be taught. They're either within you or they're not.
All right, thanks, Kamissa. Amanda, could you please share with us what are some tools or what are some programs that you're familiar with that you've been working on in other countries and other regions besides Africa? What's been successful, and maybe what are some key challenges that still remain for women's leadership and participation in the political sphere?
Yeah, definitely. I completely agree that women's empowerment is key at all levels of women's political participation as political actors, both as citizens, as elected candidates, and in all these various levels that women participate. And we look at the barriers that women face at the individual, the institutional, and the sociocultural level, right? We know that women running for national level offices or regional or provincial councils face barriers at all of these levels. And so we work in our programming to look to kind of counter these barriers that women face in these levels. So at the individual level, we try to build confidence, capacity, and connections for women. And so often women lack confidence in their leadership capacity and ability to be a candidate, or their understanding of what the laws are, what their rights are, and they have historically less access to formal education, political experiences and capacity building needed to run for office. And so we look at building these connections for women, do candidate training. In Jordan, we recently did candidate training, and those women that participated in our candidate training, 15 of them were elected through quotas, another 5 through open elections, which is, I think, quite significant because oftentimes quotas are thought to be the way in which women's participation will be most easily achieved, but women also running on open seats and winning those seats is really important. At the institutional level, right, these are where quotas come in, that there's barriers like parties and things in legislatures that prevent women from entering this space in general. The electoral system itself can present barriers. Certain systems are more difficult for women to enter, such as majority in systems versus proportional systems. At the sociocultural level, the media, for example, focuses overwhelmingly on what women wear, what they look like, if they have a family or not. So obstacles in family, the community continue to persist as major barriers for women. And so when we kind of step back and look at where women are in the global perspective, we know that over the past 2 decades, in national level politics, women have doubled their seats in parliaments. So from going from 11 to approximately 23%. We know that women hold 19 have 19 heads of state or government positions, which is, I think, quite significant. But if you look at that in the global space, that's only 6% of all seats or all heads of states positions. And there's also a wider variation when we start to look at regions specifically. We know that Latin America has made some of the most significant strides in women's political participation, both at the national and subnational levels. And that's followed by sub-Saharan Africa. But if we look at the Middle East, there are still some significant barriers for women. Many of the countries that rank lowest on women's participation are from that region. And so I think thinking about women's empowerment, both as women as citizens and as women becoming elected officials, it's very important to understand the barriers that women face, to think about key opportunities to counter these barriers, which I think Glanis's movie really highlights, that it's not only about the institutional barriers or the individual barriers, but it's about changing the understanding and perception of women at the sociocultural level. And so I think continuing progress in these areas is really important, and thinking about tackling issues on all 3 of these levels is something that we have to keep considering and pushing forward.
Thanks, Amanda. So we've all been talking about, or Amanda shared with us some tools, some programs that can be used to help promote women's participation in leadership, but in different countries. But obviously, there's no one-size-fits-all program to counter these problems. And Glanis is just a great example of that, how she's really dug down deep into her own society and culture and religion of where she's coming from, and designed something that really makes sense for her community and that speaks to the traditional leaders, the men, the women, everyone in her community. So I'd like to kind of hear more from all of you about that kind of thinking. If you'd like to share some of the research that you've been doing here, and then Kamissa and Amanda, what have your experiences been with that kind of traditional sensitive programming in different countries? Anyone can start.
Okay, I'll shoot. Yeah, that's really a good observation and point that you raised, Natalie. For me, one thing that I have seen in my context really has been how, despite wanting to promote participation of women in democratic processes in our country, the pushback is also that you're pushing for a foreign kind of agenda. This is un-Zimbabwean, it's un-African. And so as I did my work and grew the Institute for Young Women Development, I always had that at the back of my mind. And so the drive was, how do we create programs that provide the necessary knowledge and the necessary skills and tools for young women to promote their rights, to defend their rights and be able to participate, but at the same time create an associational sort of environment that appreciates that role of young women. So I've been able to really work around our cultural, the progressive cultural traits that we have in Zimbabwe, and I think most of them really quite resonate largely in the especially in sub-Saharan Africa. So I have developed programs that we've been able to tap the knowledge from the existing, those traditional rituals and practices, and also the significant values that are embedded within those practices, which ideally seek to promote open societies where women have got freedoms, where everybody else in a community feel that they have a sense of responsibility over, governance of their communities and governance of their countries. And I mean, taking that into the words of Desmond Tutu, when he tries to describe this African value system, Ubuntu, he says, Umuntu, Ngumuntu, Abantu, where he says that a person is a person because of other people and what he does and what they do to him. And so literally looking at that, we realize how the African society respects one's voice and how the other person's voice can actually largely contribute towards a more progressive and developmental society. So these are some of the values that we've integrated in our work in such a way that when we are talking about democratic spaces, when we are talking about upholding the rights of women and any other marginalized groups, we're actually talking about something that we inherently have in our own value system, but that slowly we are washing away because of the selfish interest for some people and for some governments to continuously remain on power. So, well, I would say in a summary, I've come up with a tool that I termed activism with a soul, lessons and strategies towards young women's political participation, and really that's part of how we've been able to navigate the difficult power structures in our context.
Yeah. Reactions to that?
Yeah, maybe I can
go ahead and then I can
so it looks like, for example, I would say in the United States that women do struggle with what we call here work-life balance, which means that basically your work takes an overwhelming place in your life. In the programs that I've had in West or Central Africa, and even in my personal in my family, what happens on the African continent is that your personal status or your personal life, your kids, your family, your husband, do take an overwhelming place in your work life, and they do determine how successful you are in your work life. So the programs that we have been working on, and the reason why we're so great, is that we do get proposals from groups, from women, from civil society organizations who do come to us and say, these are the issues that we're tackling on the ground, and this is what we want to work on. So we do not determine exactly what they should be working on. And the programs that I've been funding in West Africa particularly are programs of women who have decided, for example, to take part in negotiations that are exclusively reserved for men, and I'm thinking about Mali and the peace negotiations with the Tuareg rebellion, where women are not necessarily represented. And we've had programs in northern Mali where young women who have Facebook and Twitter and all of that, and who have role models on social media, have been able to train their mothers and show them some ideals that they're not necessarily exposed to. So I think that the role of social media is quite important in making sure that those cultural values and religious values are not so predominant. the objective is definitely not to get rid of them because they are part of the social fabric. But my personal opinion is that they shouldn't be as predominant as they are in some contexts.
Amanda?
Yeah, and just kind of building off of that, looking at the barriers that women still face and making sure that programming is very context specific. We have run programming in 62 different countries, but Cambodia is one of the places that we've been working on more recently. As one of the programs we've been working on, and looking at equipping with women the skills to negotiate with male counterparts. This being within their home, this being on local councils, and this being at the national level, and then also doing campaigns to change social norms and attitudes, and doing this through all different mediums, right? I think social media is a really important one, especially when the internet and the use of social media platforms are available, but also through radio and TV programming. And we've seen this happen in many of the countries that we work in, that there are, if it's a talk show between politicians in which men and women are given the opportunity to show their knowledge and give their opinions on what they think should be going on, women are very successful and people's attitudes quickly shift on women's capacity. And so I think these are really important, and I think changing attitudes and understanding the social norms that are present within a specific country really lead to very effective programming. So,
yeah, that's an interesting point, that the spread of
applications like WhatsApp, we have seen increasingly an excitement in the rural population, trying to have access to that. And so I think that really provides a means through which young women and even ordinary people in rural communities can have access to alternative information, where they can get to see also some of the role models who are doing different things in different parts of the country and the world at large. That I absolutely really feel that it does contribute. But on the no part of it, I think there's also the fact that most of the people, especially poor people in rural communities, cannot have access to, mobile technologies that can access such kind of applications. So in as much as there is that window for them to be able to be exposed to alternative information, there are structural barriers to them to having access to those kind of devices. And also I think another thing we need to take into account in the context of Zimbabwe is how the level of censorship and political polarization can actually impede sharing of information through social media. I think one of the most common phenomena of WhatsApp is that people create groups. This is how you get to share information with a lot of people, through groups. And because there is censorship, where sometimes if somebody posts something that's regarded as, political, which for me I take as partisan, because I think even the person now is political, so we shouldn't question really about how political an issue is. So people get afraid to, become targeted, and so sometimes that really limits how far people can express themselves on social media or what kind of information they can share. So that sort of like works against, the benefits that actually come with digital technologies. But I would say I think there is really need for us as activists and civil society to really be able to take advantage of the existence of social media and find ways around how we can harness and be able to make it more productive even in spaces where people are afraid. I mean, for me, I think that's really one of my strengths, where we need to be able to provide information in a structure or in a way in which people see the positive of it rather than concentrating on the negative. So even if there are diverging views, how do we reconcile for the common good? So I think, that's really more of what's more important than the barriers that exist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. Before we open up to questions from the audience, I want to give Amanda and Kamissa a chance to react a bit more to the documentary and give some advice or ask some questions to Glanis first.
Just off of the point, and then I'll get to a question about women or the use of online mediums. I think that it's true that it does provide ample opportunity for people who don't usually have access to communicate with each other too, but I think along those same lines, we see greater levels of marginalization for women on online platforms and the violence that they face in those mediums, which goes unchecked, right? Threats on their lives for raising political opinions. I mean, here and abroad, and kind of leads to self-censorship. So people that would normally be politically active and voice their opinion end up self-censoring themselves, which I think counters the purpose of social media platforms. And so I think just thinking about that and thinking about just the trend of more online platform use is that we really haven't figured out a way to protect citizens, their rights and the space for them to communicate openly.
It's the same challenges in the digital space,
yes,
as opposed to the physical space.
Yeah, definitely. In that, right? Once you leave that space, that the violence that you felt doesn't just leave because you've turned it off, right? But yeah, that was just a point I wanted to make.
Did you have any questions for Glanis?
What's next, Glanis? I mean, I think your documentary is very powerful, and I think it hits on the main points, and your work hits on the main points of looking at the multifaceted barriers that women face. And I think going forward, I would be interested in knowing what you think is next. I know that you talked about it quickly, but I'd love to hear more about that.
Well, good question. So I've stayed here for a couple of months. It's been almost 5 months. And what I've been doing really under that time is to reflect around what has worked for us in terms of strategies, in terms of approaches, in as far as promoting young women's political participation is concerned, and taking those lessons and try to also put them in a much broader context to see how they can be helpful to other young women, outside Zimbabwe. And I think one thing I have resolved is that it's quite critical to acknowledge the fact that, the African Union says the future of Africa is young. And so even globally, we see that in terms of statistics, young people tend to, constitute part of the, largest population of the world. And I really feel that I think we need to define a world in which we see our young people all as young people without looking at them in terms of the agenda and say, young women can do this and young men can do this. I really want to see a world in which young women take the center stage of any public political decision-making spaces, equally the same way the male counterparts do. And through the Girl Child, I've made lots of friends, thanks to the World Movement for filming the story, because now there are young women outside Africa who have also reached out to me in terms of how they resonate with the issues raised in the film and how we can work together. So really, moving forward, I see the ability of myself and of course and other young women working in different spaces being able to amplify the young women's voice in political spaces and really provide information and knowledge and mechanisms to ensure that existing governance institutions like the African Union or any other global institutions recognize the voice of young women and really make it part of the key international agenda moving forward, but also have the young women themselves being able to actually take up that space and offer themselves to provide leadership. So moving forward, that's what I want to see, and I am committed towards working to ensure that we really have a critical mass of young women who ready to take up political office, who are ready to provide leadership in that way, and also even have other young women who remain in civil society and continue to raise critical voices to provide the necessary checks and balances to our government. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you really transitioned to, you have the group of women in your community that you have been working with and you've inspired, and now you're trying to push them to run for office, right? Basically.
Yes, yes, that's happening at a local level, where, I mean, most of these young women feel that they are ready to provide alternative leadership as compared to what they have at the present moment. And so we need to provide them with the necessary support to take up the space that they feel they need to occupy. Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah, that's a key.
Awesome. If I may, yeah. So the emphasis here has been on young women. Young women are the future. Their capacity should be built so that they become leaders tomorrow. But what do we do with older women who have the experience, who have been there, who know what the obstacles are, who could potentially amplify the voices of young women? Do you have a specific strategy in working with them? Do you include them in your activities? What do we do with them?
So perhaps something that I may have missed out, if I had an opportunity to share more about our work and our strategies, I think I would have highlighted that we also deliberately work with elderly women. So we do our work in such a way that we identify different societal pillars that can contribute towards the cause of young women and women in general, and make them an ally. But we also look at even those adversarial voices that work against the rights of young women and other marginalized groups, and find strategic ways to get them to indirectly become allies in such a way that opens up space for us to be able to do more work and develop the young women with the necessary capacities that we need to provide them with. So we deliberately target elderly women, and I think part of our work is really also to facilitate intergenerational conversations. We acknowledge in Zimbabwe that there are women who have played key roles in the liberation struggle of Zimbabwe, and those women are still there. Mm-hmm. And we need to take advantage of their existence and be able to tap on their knowledge, on their inspirations, on their stories, and continue to use that as inspiration. I mean, for us, especially when we are faced with numerous challenges that we feel, well, they are so hard that we can't break them. So we do deliberately work with some of those women, and I think moving forward, we want to continue to be able to have that larger voice that also believes in ensuring that when young women take up the space, they do not go up and close the door, but continue to use that to actually bring in more women across the different, different distinctions or whatever that we may have that create barriers and isolate us.
All right, let's open it up to questions from the audience. I think we'll have a microphone that we'll pass around, so wait for the microphone and make sure that you introduce yourself before you speak. So here in the front, we'll do 3 at a time. So.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm Jill Morrison. I'm the director of the Leadership and Advocacy for Women in Africa program. It's an LLM program for African women's human rights attorneys. Glanis, at the beginning of your film, you had said that girls are taught to focus on what is for the good of society and not necessarily what best nurtures them. But it was apparent by the end of the film that your father had realized that they were one and the same. To what degree do you believe that message is now gaining traction, and what messages do you think are most effective in helping to promote that idea?
Okay.
Good morning. I'm Kim Weichel, CEO of Piece by Piece. My question follows a little bit right on your question. So to ensure effectiveness and success in advancing women and girls' leadership, particularly in patriarchal societies, it's really important to simultaneously educate men and boys in schools and so forth to reduce that pushback and to ensure partnership. So to what extent are you working on educating and training men and boys?
Katie. Thank you. Hi, I'm Katie Campo from the Africa team here at NED. I missed the beginning, so I apologize if you already covered this, but regarding quota systems, oftentimes the quotas will work to get women into positions in government, but usually they are shuttled into the positions that men consider, the women ministries, Ministry of Social Welfare, Ministry of Education, but there's not a lot of women necessarily in the hard-hitting positions or in the security sector. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts on having a quota system or advocacy to get more women into the security sector and law enforcement. Do you know of any countries that have had quotas for how many women, percentage of women in the police force? Has that been successful? Is this something that you would consider advocating, essentially getting more women into police forces and how that could benefit security, community security in the long run?
Thank you. So that last question, I'm sure all three of you would be happy to comment on. The first two were more toward Glanis, so if you want to start off.
The first question from Johnson is, to what extent I believe in my father's message of supporting girls. I must acknowledge that I think my father is one of the most patriarchal people. Has been one of the most patriarchal people I've ever known, also because of the religion in which we grew up in. He's very conservative in that way. And when I started my journey and defying some of the things he wanted me or the family wanted me to be doing, I tell you, it was really strange how they were ready to let go of me, disown me, just for the sake of protecting the family's name and, so-called religious kind of norms and values. And over time, the more he started listening to me, I saw him begin to loosen up a little bit, and gradually that became acceptance. That's the child they have, and that's the woman that they had to accept in that family. And he has a very high position in church. And before his transformation, he would not want to hear anything about me, and he would not even want me to come back into the church, even just coming as any other congregant. But over time, he has embraced me to the extent that he has become the ambassador even in our church. He preaches how families need to educate their children who are girls in the church. And at some point, he actually even offered to provide resources to get some of the women who have got children that they cannot afford to send to school to help them, get them educated. So in that, I think there is a bit of sincerity in his appreciation of the new me, and also acknowledging and understanding that girls are just the same as boys. Because I think for him, he sees me playing those roles that perhaps even my male siblings cannot play. So I believe that there is positive transformation that took place in him. And I think I also even see it in our societies. We work with traditional leaders. And at the beginning, you would realize that when you engage them at the beginning, it's just to get you off their space. But more and more now, I see them embracing the fact that young women can actually contribute to key decisions in certain spaces. So I see that there's positive transformation that's taking place. And I think related to your question is how we have strategically engaged with mostly opinion leaders in the societies, because they tend to determine and say more in terms of what society follows. So when we started the Institute, some of the young women had their husbands or brothers denying them to come and be part of our processes. But having those traditional leaders to now say, what they are doing is really good for the young women and for our societies, we began to see more and more men and even young men being receptive of the fact that young women have got rights and those rights need to be respected. So it's working in a positive way, but I should say I think we need to be patient, because sometimes it's really about changing norms and attitude, which tends to be a process. So we need to be able to also know when something happens in the way, when you thought you've made progress. You also need to step back and reflect and see where the challenges are, so that you continue to strategize and ensure that you continue to positively socialize the men and the gatekeepers, including my father and the traditional leaders.
All right, another question about quotas from Katie. Anyone want to take it?
I can begin.
Go ahead.
So I think quotas for women serving in like security sectors and or the police force, I am not aware of any being in place. That does not mean that they are not there. Constitutions and quotas are always evolving at different levels of government. But I know when we're talking about the security sector, NATO and UN security forces have tried over the past few years to increase the proportion of women serving on those security forces. And necessarily that's more so that women who are victims of violence or conflict have somebody to reach out to or feel a safer space because women are there and because women have different perspectives as security force officials and deal with the events of conflict just a little bit differently. I would say that having them on these usually male-dominated cabinetry positions would be quite helpful. I mean, I think we see this as a problem globally, that women don't have these positions, and I think the same perspectives that go into why people have problems with quotas are the same perspectives and opinions people would have why not having women or setting a quota for women to have certain cabinet positions. But we do know that women who serve during peace negotiations have benefit long-lasting peace and democracy. We know those figures to be true, but it's just a matter of the opinions of women actually having the capacity and skills and changing people's opinion, especially when it comes to a very male-dominated space, which is politics, but then even more heightened when you're talking about the police force or security. Changing people's opinions on that level, I think, is quite difficult, but I think we would see some positive returns with women sitting at those levels. But again, I don't know if there's any formal requirements in any countries at this point in time.
So maybe to piggyback on what you just said about quota systems, it looks like quota systems are more effective in post-conflict societies. It's the post-Civil War Liberia that elected the first woman president. She wasn't elected because there was a quota system, but just because I think that during conflicts, women assume non-traditional roles, or they assume the roles that men would traditionally play, and that makes them more poised for them to assume important leadership positions. But I think quota systems would be useful when it comes to, for example, finding an African Union mediator for a conflict. I have not seen one woman yet. That would be a good thing.
Mm-hmm. And I think, and for mediation, we do see that more and more countries are instituting quotas, or at least making sure there's a certain percentage of women, but that's usually just during the transitional period. Right. And then again, when the new government is set up, none of those proportional representation systems carry over into more of the cabinetry positions.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to share anything about Zimbabwe's system with quotas, or?
Yeah, I think quota systems have also worked quite positively for us to get more women elected, and our new constitution that we had in 2013 actually provided a couple of seats deliberately designated for women, and that helped us, heard more women. I mean, coming from a violent election in 2008, I mean, we were faced with a situation where some women were going to give up and not run for political office in 2013. But because of that provision, we actually saw, young women getting elected. But I think moving on, I feel that quota systems need not be an end in themselves. They have to be a means to get women in key decision-making positions. But states need to commit towards creating just an enabling environment for any other person to be able to run for political office. It doesn't have to rely on seats and continue to make the environment hostile for those women, to be able to provide leadership, because even when they are accorded those positions and the environment is not conducive, it still comes back to the question of women are not delivering. But you forget that the environment, the existing structures and systems are not allowing women to be able to make enough progress. So I feel that they are quite key. We need to have them in the short term, but work with a long political goal of ensuring that we create environments that allow for women in the long term to be able to, independently run for political office.
Not to beat a dead horse, but it looks like the quota systems do help women get there, but for women to be able to stay there, that's the main issue. And exactly. it comes back to the issue of the enabling environment for them to, I guess,
I think
themselves.
Yeah, and I think the long-term implementation of those quotas, if they're actually being implemented over time, and then also sometimes, I was in a country last year, and there was a teachers' strike going on, and one of the first things that came up as a way to save money was getting rid of the women's positions, because they get paid a salary. A nice salary similar to what male open elected seat positions get, but they were saying if we wanted to save a lot of money, let's get rid of the female positions, and that would the extra money we would save would just go back to teachers, which will go back to kids, because these women aren't actually making any difference. And I mean, I think that's one of the first things that sometimes gets thrown around on the chopping block.
Yeah. All right. We have time for another round of questions. So if we could pass the mic around. Art. Yeah, there's 3 hands, so that works perfectly.
Hi, my name is Lauren Huber. I'm from the Cato Institute, and I had a question. You guys have been talking more about women taking space in political and at university level, but what do you think about the effective externalities of women taking more space in the private marketplace, and strategies maybe specifically for you in the portfolio of the civil societies you deal with, that maybe if women cannot get to university, still having a means of getting vocational training or higher education and digital skills or anything that gives them a little bit more of a living wage and power of purse and influence in society. Thanks.
Go ahead.
Art Kaufman, visiting fellow here at NED. Thank you all very much for a very interesting and important discussion. If I understood correctly, Glanis, earlier you mentioned that one of the sources for encouraging the kind of change you're working for is traditional values and practices. And so obviously that's one source, but the other source would be more contemporary arguments, obviously coming out of the feminist movement, from the democracy world, et cetera. My question is, how do you discover, first of all, the traditional values and practices that you think are relevant to the work you're doing? And do you then sort of create a dialogue between the traditional values and practices that support this change and the contemporary arguments that are being made? And finally, my question really is, how do you best deal with the issues of traditional values and practices that don't support the kind of work that you're working for? Thank you.
Great.
Hi, my name is Rachel Horowitz. I'm with the Women Thrive Alliance. And my question is about, so it seemed like from your video, Glanis, that your organization creates this great network of young women to interact with each other and support each other and among civil society in your community. But we know one of the advantages that aspiring male politicians have is connections to other, mostly male politicians who are already in office, or to leaders, male leaders of political parties. And I was just wondering if you think there's any value to trying to connect women to these same traditional power structures, connecting them with male politicians and female politicians, but there are more male politicians, obviously, and to political parties, or to focus on creating new networks for women to use to advance themselves and their goals.
All right, thanks. So who wants to take the question on women in the private sector and promoting vocational training? Anyone?
I can try. Okay, so we do work on DNG mainly, but one of our core institutes is the Center for International Private Enterprise, CIPE, and they currently have a project in Senegal where they work with the Chamber of Commerce. And what we found out is that women who have not necessarily gone to school will end up in the informal sector. So they will not be working in regular offices like an educated woman would. And what they're trying to do is to make sure that these women know how to dialogue with the government on making sure that the government is able to provide them with what they need. So I think that's the type of initiatives that we are promoting as an institution.
And I would build on that. We also work with CIPE, and one of the things that they're working on is working with local chambers and looking at chambers that are specifically women business chambers as compared to male and female chambers of commerce, are represented with both men and women in the chamber, and looking at figuring out how women can to take advantage of their purse, take advantage of the money that they're making, and understand that can translate into political power or influence, just as chambers of commerce where men are taking advantage of this, teaching women the same tools and skills and networks that men have, and being able to take advantage of those things. So I think that's kind of what we're working on as well.
Yeah, and Glanis, we saw from the documentary some examples of how your organization does promote some vocational training or some skills training for the women that you work with. If you want to comment on that a little.
Well, we do take a holistic approach towards empowering young women. I mean, we really believe that the power of the purse also contributes towards enhancing the women's power to step into political spaces. So we do engage in entrepreneurial activities, but I think what's critical for us as part of that is also how we empower the young women to be able to influence policy in the private space, so that it's not it does not bring in those structural challenges that see women finding it difficult to get top leadership positions. We do it with women at a very local level, but where we can, we try to ensure that by creating space for young women to participate in political processes, they are also able to contribute towards influencing even economic policy in order to create an enabling environment. That's just the bit around the private space. Art, you asked me a very technical question, I should say, but I'll be practical about it. So we know what we want clearly as women, as feminists. It's really about ensuring that we have the same opportunities, we have equal access to different spaces. And the biggest challenge in Zimbabwe, yes, of course, it's cultural and traditional practices, but also we have a dictatorial government that closes out the space. So it's difficult for us to mobilize the strength of the women to be able to claim that space. So we then use what we have locally, the power of the local values that as a Zimbabwean society respects, open societies where women should be able to do whatever they want to have their voice heard. And so we use it as a means to open up space for us to be able to do the work that we're doing. And central to that really for us is how that creates a safe space for women to be able to claim their rights. Because if we are to do it in a way that the government reacts in their usual propaganda, is these rights that you're claiming for, this democracy that you're talking about is a foreign thing. It doesn't belong here. So when we see that our own values actually appreciate and encourage, open and inclusive societies in which citizens have got responsibility over their governance, then honestly, why should you blame us and say this is foreign? So it's really a way of bringing closer home concepts that we believe in and that we believe actually plays a central role in as far as empowering women is concerned. So the how part of it is sometimes do create dialogue with, people in power, but also we deliberately use our own local rituals in our own processes with young women, for example. And using those rituals is a symbol to our society that we still remain truly Zimbabwean and truly African in as much as we are fighting for our rights. So it's more of symbolism and what that means in a context that tries to resist ideas on the basis that they are foreign. That's how that has worked for us. And dealing with the negative, I mean, there are times when always being inside and using certain means is not easy, but if we've been able to build the necessary critical mass of many voices that now believe in this cause, it's easier for all the women to stand up and say, you know what, we are fed up of being fed up. We'll not take this. So that's also another way that we're able to deal with the negative. Where it requires us to be in the streets, we have to get into the streets. But what's critical is we would have managed to, create the necessary numbers that make the loudest voice. Yeah.
And then we had the question from Rachel, was it, about how you're connecting women to the traditional structure, and then the importance of networking.
I'm not sure if I got the question quite correctly, but I think one of the disadvantages women have generally is the issue around networks, where when it comes to political spaces, some decisions or some deals are made in pubs or in bars, and women, some of them do not have access to such kind of spaces. But what we have found useful really is identifying strategic pillars and make them allies so that women are able to negotiate and get the support of those necessary networks to be on their side. For example, I mean, with traditional leaders, when right now we have young women who want to run for political office, and of course having the traditional leaders say we openly support a space in which young women also run for office, to us is a plus, and we've managed to build a necessary network that allows the women to be able to run into office. So it's very difficult because of how patriarchal and structurally our communities continue to be. But I think it's something that we need to acknowledge, that it takes long to change the mindsets and even to get new ways of, making decisions. For example, where it no longer ceases to be about how many beers a man can buy in a pub that determines their seat on the table, but it's really their ability and commitment to provide a service to a community. So it's not an easy thing really, but there has to be ways to ensure that we try and create alternative ways for women to sell their voice.